Hello viewers and learners of the Postgraduate Diploma in Environmental and Occupational Health. Today we will discuss the module Mode of Action of Toxic Substances and the Distribution and Storage of Toxins in the Human Tissues. I introduce myself as Dr. Susmitha, bhaskar, working in the discipline of Environmental Studies at the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University. The learning modules of this module would include understanding the mode of action of the various toxicants that you have learnt, how these toxins and toxicants are actually distributed in the various organs, are they stored there, are they biotransformed, and how they can later on be eliminated from the body. And we will see the various target organs and the sites of action where these toxicants can be stored for even long periods of time. For example, the bone, this can be the storehouse of storing the toxicants for a very long period of time. In the same way, the liver and the kidney both can be storage centers of the toxicants for several years, and finally that will result in the organ toxicity and also renal failure. So let us now go on to understand the mode of action of the toxic substances. So the mode of action of any toxicant, this can occur at the cellular level, at the molecular level, and also at the organ level. Now it depends on several factors. This has been explained as the uptake of the toxicant, where the toxicant is distributed in the body, the metabolism of every individual, that plays a very important role, the mode of action of these toxicants themselves on these levels, and finally whether the toxicant will be biotransformed and eliminated from the body, or whether this is going to be stored in any of the organs in the body. Now this is a flow chart which is showing the exposure to the toxicants. So the routes of exposure to any toxicant to a human being, it can be through inhalation, through the skin by way of absorption, and ingestion by eating or drinking any of the food products. After that, it will be absorbed into the bloodstream and distributed to the various body tissues as well as the organs. After that, either the toxicant can be biotransformed and finally detoxified into a non-toxic material, and then that can be excreted and eliminated from the body. The second point is it can be stored in the body. As I told you, the kidney or the liver or the bone, they can be storehouses and reservoirs where these toxicants can be stored for several years together. The third is it can cause toxic reactions, maybe at the DNA level. It can cause certain mutations. It can bring about carcinogenesis and so on. So all these factors, finally they do delve upon the metabolism of the individual, how these are being metabolized in the body. So the different levels and mode of action of the toxicants, if we have to describe in detail, first let us go to the molecular toxicology. So this includes the effects at the biochemical and the molecular levels. It involves the enzymes that metabolize xenobiotics and the generation of reactive intermediates. It also involves the interaction of the xenobiotics with macromolecules and gene expression in metabolic activities, which will then induce the toxic pathways. Behavioral toxicology. This involves the toxic effects on the peripheral and the central nervous system and also on the endocrine glands. Nutritional toxicology. This involves the toxic effects of diet and nutrition. Carcinogenesis. It includes the effects that lead to proliferation of the cells in an uncontrolled manner. Teratogenesis. This involves chemical, biochemical and molecular events that lead to toxic effects during the development of the fetus. Mutagenesis. This involves the toxic effects that occur on the genetic material and the inheritance of these effects causing mutagenicity. Organ toxicity. This is the toxic effects at the organ level. Now this can be neurotoxicity, that is occurring to the brain toxicity, hepatotoxicity, which is the toxicity that occurs to the liver. Nephrotoxicity is the toxicity at the kidney level. Then we also have immunotoxicity and reproductive toxicity. All this depends on the type of the organ that is involved, and that is why we refer this to as organ toxicity. Now, sites of toxic action. As I told you, the site of the action is very important. What kind of change is going to occur because of the toxic action at a particular spot, at a particular site in the human body. So, enzyme inhibition, enzyme activation. So, you all know that enzymes are very important. They are catalysts of several reactions in the body. So, one important site of toxic action for the metals is the interaction with the enzymes. It results either in enzyme inhibition or enzyme activation. Now, the enzyme inhibition can occur due to interaction, for example, between the metal and the sulfhydryl groups on the enzyme, or some of the metals can even displace an essential metal cofactor of the enzyme. So, in this diagram you can see how the apoenzyme becomes active by binding of the coenzyme or a cofactor to an enzyme, and after activation you will see that holoenzyme is formed when an associated cofactor or a coenzyme binds to the enzyme's active site. So, therefore, enzyme activation, enzyme inhibition, all these are occurring, and the heavy metals and several other toxicants, they can displace the essential metal cofactors which are important in any body reaction. Subcellular organelles. Toxic metals have the ability to disrupt the structure and function of a number of the subcellular organelles. For example, we have the endoplasmic reticulum, we have the mitochondria, we have several respiratory enzymes. So, there can be toxic effects that can occur at the subcellular level at the organelles. So, for example, enzymes that are associated with the endoplasmic reticulum, these may be inhibited and the metals can be accumulated in the lysozymes. Now, for example, respiratory enzyme, mitochondria can be inhibited and metal inclusion bodies can be produced in the nucleus. So, these are all the several toxic effects that can occur at the subcellular organ levels. Carcinogenic effects. Some compounds, for example, the chromium containing compounds, arsenic, nickel and the cadmium, they all cause the carcinogenic effects. So, this may be due to the interaction of the metallic ions with the DNA. Kidney. Common target organs for the metal toxicity remain the kidney for many of the heavy metals. For example, cadmium, then the mercury. So, these are all nephrotoxicants because they cause toxicity to the kidney and the entire excretory system. Then the nervous system. So, the nervous system is also a common target, especially the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, the cerebrospinal fluid. All these can be common targets of the toxic organic metal compounds like methyl mercury. This will readily cross the blood-brain barrier and it will enter the nervous system. The endocrine and the reproductive system. So, lead, this can cause testicular degeneration, inhibition of spermatogenesis and also Leydig cell atrophy. So, all these organs can be affected due to the several and different kinds of the toxicants, especially heavy metals we have taken in this case. Respiratory system. So, this system can be affected by the inhalation of metal dust. For example, you can have the asbestos dust or for example cotton dust, and even the industries that are manufacturing sugarcane, you have the bisonosis and the bagasosis which come from the cotton as well as the sugarcane industry. So, these are all the biological matter and dust, but again you can have the metal dust, for example the asbestos or certain other metal industries, which are fine particulate metal dust which can cause irritation and inflammation of the respiratory tract. So, chronic exposure to these metallic dust particles, they can give rise to fibrosis. Aluminum dust exposure, then it can also cause carcinogenesis, arsenic, chromium and nickel metal exposures, cadmium, nickel, which is all used in the battery manufacturing sectors, that can give also rise to fibrosis and also carcinogenesis. The exposure routes. So, in that flow chart in the first two slides we explained the basic exposure routes. So, they mainly include the skin, the lung and the gastrointestinal tract. Let us now go into detail about each of these exposure routes and the organs involved. So, the skin, this is the largest organ in the human body and it is a physical barrier to the absorption of toxic substances. Let me tell you, the skin is quite thick and it will prevent the absorption of many of the toxic substances, and it is the first physical barrier when compared to the gastrointestinal tract. Here easily when you eat anything or drink, the toxicant can easily be carried into the system, but the skin still it is a thick barrier, and there is a physical barrier which will prevent the entry of many of the toxic substances. The other major routes are the respiratory and the gastrointestinal tract. These give less resistance to the toxicant absorption than the other, like for example than the skin. So, the respiratory tract is most rapid route for the entry, and the skin is the least rapid route for entry. That is what I explained now. The difference is due to the thickness of the membranes. As I told you, the skin is quite thick when compared to these two membranes. So, here is the diagram of the human skin membrane. So, you see that the skin is a complex multi-layered tissue. You have the epidermis, you have the dermis, you have the hypodermis. Then of course, you have all the blood vessels that are carrying the blood and for the necessary, and you also have the hair follicles and so on. So, there are several factors like the skin anatomy, the skin physiology and the biochemistry. All this vary among the species and also within species. Even the melanin content, some people will have a higher amount of the melanin content and some will have the lesser amount of the content, and the color also depends upon this pigment which is present in the body in our genes. So, relatively the skin has a large surface area that is exposed to the environment. So, these factors can influence absorption, and let me tell you, our skin is permeable to many of the toxicants. Dermal exposure, basically to pesticides and industrial chemicals. This can result in severe systemic toxicity. So, the human skin is 3 millimeters thick, and the epidermis provides the greatest resistance to the toxicant penetration, that is the outer layer of the skin. Most of the systemic absorption, this occurs at the capillary loops located at the epidermis dermis junction. Certain other factors like airflow, the temperature and the humidity, these can also influence the dermal absorption. The next is the lungs and the respiratory system. So, here in this diagram you can see the respiratory system, which includes the nose, the mouth, the pharynx, the trachea, the bronchus, which is then branching into the bronchioles, and then of course you have the alveoli. So, these can reduce the toxicity of the airborne particulate substances. There is little or no absorption in these structures, that is the nose, mouth, pharynx, trachea and the bronchus. But the cell lining of the respiratory tract, that can absorb the agents which can cause the toxicological effects. So, the absorption site over here in the lungs is the alveoli capillary membrane, and that is very thin. It allows for the rapid exchange of the gases and the vapors. The residual volume, which we calculate in the biological studies, this is the amount of air that is retained in the lung despite maximum expiratory effort. So, hence the toxicants may not be cleared out completely and immediately due to the slow release from this residual volume. The rate of entry of some of the vapor phase toxicants, this is controlled again by the alveolar ventilation rate. Now, the site of deposition of the particles in the respiratory tract, it is dependent on several factors. So, this depends on the aerodynamic behavior of the particle size, the density, the shape of the particle, hygroscopicity, the breathing pattern of an individual and the lung airway structure. So, tiny particle sizes, what we refer to as the particulate matter, this can get through the nasopharyngeal regions and it can reach the alveoli, and these are medically significant. That is why that is a cause of concern when we talk about the particulate matter significantly in the air pollution. The next is the gastrointestinal tract. So, in this diagram you can see the entire structure of the gastrointestinal tract from the esophagus, then it descends into the stomach, then we have the duodenum, then you have the small intestine and the large intestine, then we have the colon, the rectum and the anus, and of course the appendix, which is a vestigial organ, and sometimes people need to operate this and go in for an appendicitis. So, this gastrointestinal tract, this provides least resistance and easily a toxicant can enter the body. So it is lined by a layer of the columnar cells and it is protected by mucus. It gives minimal resistance to the toxicant penetration. Most of the absorption occurs in the intestine and then it occurs in the stomach. So now in many of the cases, these days you are seeing a number of people are suffering from the colon cancer and also cancer of the rectum. So this is also something which we need to ponder about, and research is still going on, research is still required. We need to see what are the toxicants of environmental origin and environmental factors, even biological origin, which may be responsible for causing carcinogenesis and cancer in the colon as well as in the rectum regions. Also buccal and rectal absorption, this can further occur in some cases. Absorption is through passive diffusion mostly, except for some nutrients, glucose, amino acids and also certain drugs. The smaller the particle size of the toxicant, the greater is the absorption. For absorption in this tract, the chemical or the toxicant, it should be in an aqueous form so that it could be easily getting into the system. Next we come on to bacterial endotoxins. So there are exotoxins and endotoxins. So bacterial toxins, they are also of concern. The same way we have the large particles of the azo dyes and also carcinogens. They can all be absorbed by the endocytotic mechanisms. So the gastrointestinal system provides a large array and an entry or a source, by which all these bacterial or the viral toxins and the azo dyes and other carcinogens can be easily absorbed, and it can get into the system and cause different types of toxicity. Therefore, the gastrointestinal tract motility is important in the absorption of any toxicant. The rapid movement of the gut, that can reduce absorption by reducing the residence time. Next is the distribution and the storage of the toxins. So we have seen the mode of action of the toxins, the site of action where the toxins can produce their effects, the sources and the sites of inhalation, that is the routes of the exposure, where that is through the inhalation or through the skin by absorption or through ingestion. Now let us see where the toxins or the toxicants can be distributed and stored in the human body. Passage of toxicants across the placenta. So here in this figure you can see an unborn baby, or that is a fetus. It is still yet to come into the final forms of the development. At this point of time, if the mother consumes anything which can be toxic to her, it can easily enter the placental barrier, and this through simple diffusion the placental barrier can be crossed, and many of the even some pesticides they are reported to enter, and then again there are several other toxins and toxicants which can just enter and affect the fetus by simple diffusion mechanisms. So readily and easily the toxicants, when they are lipid soluble, fat loving substances, then they can enter the placenta and cause embryonic lethality, death of that embryo which is formed. Therefore, the fetus is exposed to almost all the drugs, even if low lipid solubility drugs are consumed by the mother. So that is why at that stage of the gestation, very specific drugs are prescribed by the doctors, and a lot of counseling is given by the medical practitioners, where the mothers are advised what to eat and what not to eat, and to make very important food choices. Blood-brain barrier. So here in this diagram you can see a normal blood vessel and you can see a brain blood vessel. Can you find any difference in both of them? Right? So this is obvious. You can see the amount of the membranes and even the thickness of the blood-brain barrier. That means that very easily any chemical of any chemical origin or any toxicant cannot easily access the brain, because once the brain tissues are damaged, very rarely you will find that people are affected with meningitis or with any other brain cancer or any other symptoms and syndromes which are affecting the central nervous system. So that means that toxicant has to have so much of potential that it has to cross this BBB or the blood-brain barrier. So this blood-brain barrier is limiting the distribution of the toxicant into the central nervous system as well as the cerebrospinal fluid. There are several membranes the toxicant has to cross in order to get into the cerebrospinal fluid. So, certain diseases like meningitis, this will disrupt this barrier and it can allow even the antibiotics and toxicants to penetrate. So, that is why the heavy metals like for example lead, that can easily penetrate the BBB and that can cause the neurotoxicity. Plasma. So, plasma protein, this will bind the acidic drugs more extensively than any other species. Carcinogenesis, liver abscess, kidney disease and age. These are all factors which can reduce the serum albumin. They alter the chemical protein binding characteristics. Liver and the kidney. These are two very important organs and they are very important in biotransformation of these chemicals into non-toxic forms and eliminating the chemical substance or the toxicant from the body. Now, if these two organs are affected, then finally there is going to be organ toxicity and the entire system of a person will then be affected. So, that is why the liver function and the kidney function test, whenever the doctor prescribes, they always go together. They will always analyze the liver function, the serum creatinine, the serum urea, other things like for the nitrogen and so on, and also the several other tests which are involving the blood test. So, why? Because these two go along hand in hand and together, and even in the kidney, if there is one kidney, even then a person can function and live. But if even that one kidney's function also is reduced to even less than 3% or less than 2%, then they have to go in for dialysis and several other complications also result, because there is accumulation of the toxic things in your body and the body is not able to eliminate these in the form of the the excretory products and the urine. So, when these get affected, then they can store more of the toxicants than any other tissue in the entire body. Organochlorine pesticides, DDT for example, they are easily absorbed in the liver and here they can remain in the liver for long periods of time if they are not biotransformed. So, in this figure you can see the liver cirrhosis and the scarring of the livers when it occurs when the liver is chronically affected with toxicants. So, therefore, liver is a major storage organ for water insoluble toxic heavy metals and some toxicants are stored in the liver. For example, the anti-malaria drug, this can accumulate in the liver as a result of reversible intracellular binding, and the concentration in the liver can be several thousand times than that of the plasma which we discussed in the previous slide. In the kidney again, there are certain substances which can cause nephrotoxicity. So, that was about hepatotoxicity, that is liver toxicity. Now, the kidney, certain large molecules such as proteins, they do not easily pass through the walls of the Bowman capsule. In this figure, in the diagram, you can see the Bowman capsule, the glomerulus, you can see the arteries and the veins for where the blood is supplied and where the venous blood is being collected, that is the renal vein also. And then you can see what are the functions that the kidney is doing, okay, filtration, reabsorption of certain essential nutrients, then secretion and also excretion. So, there are a lot of functions that the kidney does, and that is why when the kidney function is affected, then the overall system of a person, it goes kaput, it goes in disorder. Further, unbound metals like cadmium and mercury, they can be reabsorbed in the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule. Inside the cell, they can bind to the metallothionein, resulting in concentration of the toxicants in the kidney. The kidneys also, they can store 10 times the amount of cadmium found in the liver, and it can be stored for even 10 years or even more. Finally, bioaccumulation in the kidney, that can cause complete renal failure. Fat tissues. So, we have the pesticides, chlorinated biphenyls accumulate in the high concentration in the fat tissue, that is the adipose tissue. This is a reservoir for persistent organic pesticides. A number of drugs and pollutants can be stored here. A bone. So, the lead can easily replace calcium and it can be stored in the bones. And here again the bone can store the toxicants for 10 or even up to 20 years. A lung. Particulate material like asbestos, fiberglass toxicants can be stored in the lung and they can give rise to several respiratory diseases and scarring of the lung tissues. Blood. The erythrocytes and the lymph, they transport the toxicants. Water soluble toxins can be stored in the blood. like arsenic, thorium, cadmium, chlorinated pesticides, bisphenol A. Okay, this bisphenol A is one which is found in the plastic bottles. So that is why we find these days in the market BPA free plastic bottles for drinking the water, because this bisphenol A will target the blood system. Then they can bind with the plasma protein, the albumin, transferrin, globulin and also the lipoprotein. So even blood also the toxicants can be stored and they can cause irreversible effects in the blood. Therefore, in this module we have understood the mode of action and the site of action of the several toxicants. We have seen some examples like lead, mercury, then arsenic, then nickel. Then we have also seen how the particulate matter, like that is coming from the asbestos, the aluminium material, then from the nickel plating industries. Then we have also seen from the all the other biological toxicants, okay, how these can enter the system. In the same way, cotton and the from the cotton industry and from the sugarcane industry, fine particulate matter that can enter the respiratory system. Certain other toxicants also we have seen, the heavy metals like lead, mercury, cadmium, these can all be stored in the bone, it can be stored in the kidneys and also in the liver, where it can cause scarring of the liver and they can cause irreversible effect. Finally, all these toxins by the various routes of exposure, they are being distributed and they are being stored in the organs. They can cause the organ failure, organ toxicity and finally death of the individual. We have also learnt about the routes of exposure through which the toxic substance can enter our healthy body. We have seen that the skin is giving you the first line of defense and that provides the greatest protection for the entry of many of the toxic substances being absorbed into the system. Then we have seen the respiratory system, we have seen the gastrointestinal tract which can easily and readily get into the system, the toxicants can get into the system. In the same way, the placental barrier and the blood brain barrier, how these two also can be easily, many of the toxicants can easily enter these two barriers and they can readily penetrate and cause a lot of the damage to the nerve tissues, to the nervous systems and also embryonic lethality to the unborn fetus and child. Therefore, the toxicants can be absorbed, distributed and stored in the various tissues and organs of the human body, finally causing renal or organ toxicity and failure. Thank you for your patient listening.